Be me. Be, I don't know, years old. I can't read yet, but that's not going to stop me from trying to play X-Wing versus TIE Fighter on my parents' computer. So I fire up the game, launch into the tutorial, promptly run out of energy for my forward cannons, and throw a fit because I don't understand how to reroute power from engines to weapons. I think the game is broken, and this formative experience turns me off from hardcore flight simulations for a long time. Fast forward 6.5 million years, and EA announces Star Wars Squadrons, and boy, was that the least excited I'd ever been for a Star Wars video game announcement. But I'm willing to give it a shot. I fell in love with Jedi Starfighter, and that turned me around on the idea of arcade first-person dogfighting games. Squadrons could do the same for sophisticated combat flight simulators. It didn't, but I did have enough fun that I'm willing to give the older games a second chance just for the novelty of it. So while I did have more fun than I feared, I didn't have enough fun as I'd hoped. Part of this is the game's focus on multiplayer, and the fact that its campaign is mostly a glorified tutorial. That's overall fine, it just means that once I'm done with the campaign, I don't have much else pulling me back in. To its credit, the controls feel fairly easy to use, even if its flight simulation is significantly more complex than the old Nintendo 64 and GameCube games. Either way, Squadrons is a fairly good starting point for people potentially interested in combat flight simulators. It also boasts support for a variety of peripherals, so if you bought a sweet control scheme for the new Microsoft Flight Simulator, chances are you can use it here. The bottom line is if you already knew you were going to love this game because you love the old 90s combat sims, you're still going to love this game. And I can even pretty easily recommend Squadrons if you're curious about what all the fuss is about these X-Wing games people can't stop talking about. But if you're like me and aren't too thrilled about competitive multiplayer and need more than 10-ish hours tutorial campaign to keep you hooked, I'd recommend getting the game on sale or asking for it as a gift this holiday season. At the end of the day, I give Star Wars Squadrons a Biggs Darklighter action figure out of 5. But the straightforward purchasing recommendation isn't what I find most interesting about Star Wars Squadrons, and while I didn't fall in love with the game, I'm endlessly fascinated by the choices it made as an adaptation. So welcome to another episode of Total Conversion, where we talk about the weird and wonderful world of game adaptations. I think the most important thing to keep in mind when thinking about Star Wars Squadrons is that it was built from the beginning to take advantage of VR. It was one of the earliest parts of their prototyping phase, partly because they thought it would be cool, but also because they felt that a first-person combat flight simulation is the exact kind of game design that would expertly bridge both virtual reality and traditional screen-bound games. Now, I only played on a base PS4 because I don't own any VR equipment, so I can't speak to that particular experience, but their decision to bridge the two experiences most definitely led to compromises in VR's favor that mostly end up causing problems for the campaign. Before I dive into that, I think it's important to mention that Motive really knocked it out of the park when it came to the in-game presentation. Cole Henry over on Medium explains it more eloquently than I ever could, but there's a kind of physicality to the game that's tangible even outside of VR and with a normal PlayStation controller. Clever animations and the choice to make the UI almost entirely diegetic go a long way to immerse you into the world. Hell, it's such a convincing presentation that I felt it was a bit claustrophobic, especially in the TIE Fighter family of ships. It's part of the reason I wasn't too thrilled with the game, but my discomfort is just undeniable proof of Motive's success. On top of this phenomenal presentation is a brilliantly crafted soundscape whose crowning achievement isn't actually the pitch-perfect recreation of classic movie sound effects, but the decision to give the player character a voice. So Squadrons includes a pretty rudimentary character builder. It's gated through in-game progression, but even the limited options you have at the start are a good way for the player to voluntarily buy into the fantasy. And while it's true that custom character voices associated with distinct personalities aren't new, Squadron leverages this feature to spectacular effect in multiplayer. The character barks are more than just functional and informative utterances with minimal flair. It's colorful, and each personality interacts with all the others in unique ways that go a long way to help you forget that you're in a lobby with a rotating set of strangers for just 15 minutes at a time. There's an implied history and relationship to the way custom characters interact, and more than any other feature, really sells the fantasy that you're participating in dogfights ripped out of A New Hope or any other film in the franchise. That all goes out the window in the campaign, however. Your self-insert player avatar is functionally mute, with their barks coming out much less frequently, but they also feel incredibly alien and detached. The repetition isn't so bad across several 15-minute multiplayer matches, but over 14 half-hour-ish long campaign missions, it makes your custom character sound a bit like an aloof asshole without any meaningful connection to your squad mates. This kind of sort of works for the Imperial part of the campaign, but it's a non-starter for parts involving the New Republic, and it gets even worse when you step outside your cockpit. In between missions, you're dropped directly into a hangar, but rather than letting you walk around and inspect and explore your own, you're rooted in place. So if you want to get a better look at your ship, you'll need to cut between a few preset camera positions, fading to black anytime you want to move. It's awkwardly immersion breaking, but I can only assume this was done in order to minimize motion sickness in VR, which is honestly admirable, and the limited camera movements work out just fine, especially during briefing room segments, which are evocative of the old Rogue Squadron mission briefings. However, this same style of presentation absolutely neuters conversations with your squad mates. Every time you want to talk to your fellow New Republic or Imperial pilots, the view fades to black, then cuts to the NPC in the center of the screen facing you directly. It's a staging reminiscent of Bethesda Fallout or Elder Scrolls RPGs, and it just doesn't work here at all. It may seem like just a small thing, but the camera adjustments and character movements those games did in order to center the NPC in the frame went a long way to preserving the sense of immersion these RPGs offered. Even when these games merely unlocked the player's controls after the conversation was over, they still did far more for immersion than the Squadron's constant fading to black. Even worse is that if you have experience with the later Fallout or Elder Scrolls games, then the choice to play as a custom character and also have the NPC conversations center the NPC in the screen implied the possibility of dialogue choices or at least some basic interactivity. But instead, every character is just talking at you like they're Jonathan Frakes doing a beyond belief model. This gets extra weird and immersion breaking when these monologues have built-in pauses like they're expecting you to respond, but your character just sits there desperately trying to nail their Raymond Teller impersonation. It absolutely doesn't work. And all the careful time spent building meticulous cockpits and soundscapes do nothing to salvage a storytelling presentation that can be at best described as functional. And unfortunately, this merely functional storytelling makes the campaign feel less like the sum of its parts. You don't even have to rely on fan films or source filmmakers to see that what a more traditional AAA cutscene-filled version of Squadrons would look like, because the campaign is lightly peppered with the kinds of cutscenes you'd find in Fallen Order or Battlefront. They do a lot more work to sell the feeling that these pilots have a history and relationship beyond the one merely told at you, but don't do enough to bridge the gaps caused by the campaign's very stiff monologuing. It's a tragically immersion-breaking decision that I can only ascribe to the limitations placed on the writing team to balance both VR and screen-based gaming, and all of these complaints are just on the technical execution of the damn thing. We haven't even gotten to the story itself. Now, to be fair, the story can be split into two parts, and my issue isn't with the half of the campaign that sees you flying for the New Republic. I actually quite like the pilots of the New Republic. While I may have wanted a little bit more time with both Gunny and Grace, I feel like Keo could have used an editing pass so their hotshot racing spirit and spirituality didn't feel so disjointed and unrelated to each other. But Fisk is this lovable, anxious lizard con man, and Lyndon James paints a good enough portrait of a man committed to atoning for his previous Imperial service. Plus, the affection that they have for each other is believable, even if the relationship they have with your custom character isn't. But the Imperial campaign not only suffers from the previously mentioned framing issue, it also fails to meaningfully engage with its implied themes. And this is where things get super weird, and it's hard for me to suss out what might be on purpose and what might be because of the Bethesda camera angles. See, the characters in the Imperial campaign don't seem to have the same kind of close relationship as their New Republic counterparts. But Titan Squadron doesn't have the same kind of hostile aloofness as much as a polite and professional working relationship. While you don't get the sense that Titan Squadron cares to hang out with each other, you do get the feeling that they don't just merely tolerate each other and do have a baseline amount of concern for each other's well-beings. Especially Varco Gray, the squadron's wing commander, constantly makes sure to check up on the squad, encouraging them to take care during battle and to make sure that they come back in one piece. Now, maybe the intent is that Gray is a sort of misguided middle manager, just doing his due diligence to make sure that the literal human resources of the Empire do their job, but I can't help but read in a softer, more sincere intent. A big part of this is how the Bethesda presentation primes me to do a little bit more work in reading, in scare quotes, character intentions and tone. And because the New Republic absolutely facilitates a kind of we're all a big family fighting the good fight interpretation of Vanguard Squadron's relationship, it's really easy to look at the way Titan Squadron interacts as being as in line with Vanguard rather than in opposition to it. It also doesn't help that both squadrons absolutely love the player's self-insert avatar, which just further drives home this feeling. This has the maybe unintentional consequence of softening the edge on these otherwise awful people. Gray is an authoritarian who justifies himself exclusively through the idea that because the Empire is powerful, it has the right to dictate the universe. And by extension, he has the right to enforce it however he sees fit. Von Reg is a Nazi punk fueled by spite and a pathological need for revenge. Sol is an opportunistic ladder climber who believes piloting a TIE fighter is her one-way ticket to political power. And Shen is a Costco brand Darth Vader too angry to die. On top of that, the Imperial campaign's bonus objectives encourage the player to commit war crimes and participate in genocide, while your squad mates cheer you on. And yet I can't help but get the feeling that the Imperial campaign's attempt at nuance merely humanizes what would otherwise be unambiguous villains. Now, I do want to make something very clear here. I'm not of the opinion that playing as a bad guy in a video game automatically means that the game is pro the bad things that you do, nor do I think exploring stories from a Sith or Imperial perspective is an attempt at justifying their atrocities. There's a long history as far as the old expanded universe of telling dark side stories with depth or nuance without contradicting or complicating the fairy tale storytelling of the original films. Even the prequels dedicate a lot of time to painting a portrait of Anakin's fall to the dark side, do their best to portray it as a tragic and utterly preventable outcome had the institutions Anakin grew to rely on didn't systemically fail him over and over again. It's also important to keep in mind that even in the stories where the dark side wins, it comes at a significant cost, either to the galaxy at large and their success is portrayed as an unmitigated evil for the galaxy, or to themselves, either because they lose a loved one or don't find happiness, or they inevitably lose all their ill-gotten gains. How these stories end is an important part of their overall theming, and if the Imperial missions of Star Wars Squadrons would have stuck its landing, a lot of my issues would go away. But it didn't, and that might be its biggest problem. Spoilers for the last couple of missions, by the way. Something I haven't mentioned up until now is that the New Republic and Imperial campaigns are chronologically woven together. This is actually a pretty cool idea, especially since you have two custom characters fighting on opposite sides. Unfortunately, there's not really any meaningful payoff. The penultimate mission of the campaign is the final Imperial mission. You succeed in critically damaging the Starhawk prototype and shooting down Lyndon Javes in combat. So with victory secured, Titan Squadron then leaves the battle to report the success to Admiral Sloan, and at this point it's heavily implied that the remaining Imperial forces should follow Titan Squadron's example and return to their original posts rather than continue fighting New Republic forces for absolutely no benefit. The final cutscene lavishes you with praise, grants you the title of Flight Baron, all but explicitly states that if everyone in the Empire was just as cool and competent as you, then the war would be over in no time. It's a little bit too congratulatory, especially given that you've explicitly committed war crimes, genocide, and given that the final mission accidentally implies that your actions as an Imperial do not matter. Since they're backed into a corner, Vanguard Squadron sorties out again in the hopes of buying enough time for the engineers of the Temperance to fix its hyperdrive and jump to safety. To that end, they crash the derelict Starhawk into a nearby moon, detonating it and wiping out the Imperial forces in orbit. The post-mission cutscene even points out that the surviving engineers were able to build 3 more ships based on the Starhawk prototype, and the Aftermath books explicitly state that they were crucial at the Battle of Jakku. These same books also show that the Imperial forces under Admiral Sloan eventually formed the First Order. Of course, you don't need to have read the books to get the feeling that the accolades given at the end of the Imperial missions feel hollow and almost unwarranted. You commit atrocities in the name of the Empire, but rather than taking the time to really examine the severity of your actions or even float the possibility of meaningful consequence, the game just gives you a pat on the back and a gold star. Which is a shame because Squadrons had some pretty cool ideas. I love the idea of dueling perspectives in a campaign. It's kind of evocative of old school RTS campaigns, but more tightly woven together. I especially love using custom player characters in this kind of structure. Like how cool would it be if instead of Titan Squadron just hyper jumping off into the sunset, they stuck around and you had to work with Vanguard to shoot down Titans one by one until only you and your 2 custom pilots are dogfighting alone in some dramatic showdown. I don't think I've ever heard of a video game doing something so weird and dramatic with what basically amounts to player self-inserts. It would also better gel thematically with the rest of Star Wars and make for a super cool story, even if the presentation was a bit iffy most of the time. But that's neither here nor there, and for all my complaints, Squadron was always pitched as a multiplayer-focused Star Wars-themed combat flight simulation. The campaign was always intended as an extended tutorial, and the story is otherwise fine. I also get the feeling that with its $40 MSRP and the fact that EA has not announced any plans to publish a next-gen version of the game, Star Wars Squadrons feels like a trial run for the potential of a full-price AAA experience that'll have live service elements and be powered by better hardware. I wouldn't be surprised if in 18 to 24 months a sequel is released just in time for the holiday season, with more robust ship selections and multiplayer options. I don't think the campaign will get the same kind of love, but who knows? Maybe they'll go all in on the Fallout RPG look and actually give you dialogue options. Thanks for watching.